thank you all so much for joining us for the Monuments Men of World War II with Mary Woodward. This is a story of the men and women of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Division of the U.S. Army during World War II, known as the Monuments Men. They risked their lives to protect, salvage, restore, and return works of art that were systematically damaged, destroyed, misappropriated, or stolen in Europe during the years 1933 and 1945. Though hundreds of thousands of items remain missing or destroyed, through the efforts of the Monuments Men, 5 million objects were recovered, saving important pieces of history and culture for posterity. Let me tell you a little bit about Mary Woodward. She serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator and educator at the Concord Museum. She has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has over 40 years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James Polk. And again, I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring the program today. So all 40 of us or so who are watching live on Zoom, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Robert, for that rousing introduction. I love it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And thank you again to the Tewksbury Library for asking me back to share some more armchair art history with you today. As Robert says, we're looking at the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Division of the U.S. Army during World War II, the Monuments Men. And the years we are looking are 1933. That was seminal because that's when Hitler became the German chancellor, and 1945, when the war ended. The Monuments Men were comprised of 345 men and women from 14 countries. The overwhelming majority were from the United States and the United Kingdom, but others were from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and even Australia, as the war stretched into the Pacific Theater. They were all allies in the efforts to protect and restore personal possessions and cultural and artistic heritage. Today, we'll focus on their work in Western Europe. In order to grapple with this complex narrative, I'm going to introduce some of them to you by name, and we're going to follow the movements of some of the world's most precious works of art, from the security of their owners' homes and museums to the far-flung places from which they were recovered. Our topic, the Monuments Men of World War II, is the story of art theft on such a grand scale that it's almost unbelievable. Some of you may have seen the 2014 Hollywood movie called The Monuments Men, and while they took a few liberties, mainly compressing events in order to tell a story, I believe they accurately captured the struggles that these men and women faced. So what was happening in Europe that warranted the creation of the Monuments Men in the first place? As one author writes, Lynn Nicholas, looting has always been part of it, but the magnitude of the operations of the Nazis' art-gathering agencies far surpassed anything previously attempted. Their actions were not merely stealing done in the heat of battle, but were ideological programs carefully linked to Nazi racial and genocidal initiatives.
Mary, can I stop you for a second? I apologize. So about 30 seconds ago, we started getting some rustling noise, I guess I would call it. Is there anything in front of your speaker?
Yeah, it was my paper. So thank you. I'll put that down, and thank you very much.
Yep.
In order to try and grasp the magnitude of what happened during those years in Europe, here's an astonishing number that doesn't even take into account works that were destroyed on the spot. By the end of the war, the Nazi regime had shipped 1.5 million train cars worth of artwork and artifacts from German-controlled Europe to Nazi Germany. Much of the research into the Monuments Men and their brave actions has been done by the author Robert Edsel. When Hitler rose to power, Edsel writes, two of the most dangerous and compelling aspects of his personality were already in place: his love of art and his hatred for those of the Jewish faith and others he considered inferior to Germans. As a young man, Hitler had failed to get into art school, and he particularly blamed the Jewish members of the admissions panel for this. He also had a burning desire to elevate his hometown of Linz, Austria, to become the new art center of the world, to rival Paris and Florence. He wanted Linz to have a museum with nothing less than the most important artwork in the world. And while it wasn't to be named after him or named the Führer Museum, that is the nickname that people used for it. Hitler had lists drawn up of artworks located around the world that he thought should be in the museum. There were those incomparable pieces of artwork that everyone acknowledged as the very best. But in addition to that, he had a certain criteria of art he wanted as well, that he felt belonged to his country. They included works that were made in Germany, or works made by artists who had been German or Austrian, that were in the Germanic style, works that were commissioned in Germany or completed in Germany, or that had left Germany since the year 1500. Now, that's a pretty large scope of art to attempt to gather. And to begin with, the stealing, the gathering, was done in a pretty orderly way by the Nazis. Art was stored properly and records were actually kept. Here's an art storage view there, obviously a photo that we got from the Allies or perhaps found among the Nazis' things. The piece of paper I want to point out is the record, an acquisition record. They've given an object a number. It happens to be an antique gold ring, and they've given a number to it. The Nazis have filed the number away in their record keeping. They failed to mention that they've stolen this piece from the Rothschilds. Well, there were works that didn't meet Hitler's definition of excellence and were therefore considered inferior. And Hitler meant to rid this art from the new German world that he planned to create. So Impressionist and modern art, works by Van Gogh and Picasso, for instance, were labeled degenerate. Hitler in 1937 ordered the seizure of roughly 16,000 works of degenerate art from private homes, from dealers, even from state-run German museums. Countless numbers of these works were destroyed immediately. We'll never know that number. Some of them were put up for auction. And one famous auction was held in Luzerne in 1939. And it was attended by American and European museum directors, dealers, and collectors. Yes, they knew that their money was going to fund the Führer. Still, some purchased works of art as a way of saving it. This 1888 self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh was removed from the State Museum in Munich and put in the auction by the Nazis. You see the photo on the left there of the man holding it up for auction. It was purchased by a private collector who years later gave it to the Fogg Museum at Harvard. Make no mistake about it, this type of art looting was part of the Nazis' overall plan for Europe's ethnic cleansing. The Nazis justified the looting on the basis that much of these works were ownerless. So allow me to explain how their twisted logic worked. For example, fearing for their lives, many Jewish families fled from their home countries. Before they left Paris, the wealthy Rothschild family tried to transfer their art into the collections of the state-run French museums in an effort to protect the art. Unfortunately, the Germans didn't acknowledge that transfer. To them, the works were considered abandoned by their owners and therefore designated as ownerless. They could therefore be gathered and sent to Germany for safeguarding. And it wasn't just art that was taken, it was furniture, silverware, carpets, family photos, family papers, basically all evidence of the owners' lives. It was in this way that the painting, said to be Hitler's favorite painting, left the collection of the Rothschilds and made its way towards Nazi Germany. Jan Vermeer's 1668 masterpiece called The Astronomer is seen here on the left in the Rothschilds' Paris home. And you've put a little green circle around it, before it was taken by the Nazis. Its next home will be the Austrian salt mines, and we will catch up with it there when the Allies get to the mines. Here is a photo of the Paris depot that contained the household goods from nearly 70,000 Jewish homes taken by the Germans after they invaded France. When it came time for the victorious Allies to clear out this depot, the stolen items here alone filled more than 27,000 train cars, more than 27,000 rail cars to clear out the objects in this collection point. This was the state of things in Europe from 1933 until 1941. US museum and military officials were aware of the looting and the destruction, but it wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 and the US's entry into the war that the Monuments Men were created. Less than 2 weeks, and I find that hard to imagine, less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, American museum officials met at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City to discuss a plan of action. The first day, they were shown images of major museums and historical sites in Europe, empty museum galleries. On the right, you see the winged Victory, the giant sculpture at the Louvre, being rolled down the staircase by museum staff and taken to a safer place in order to keep it from invading Germans. Well, what about the state of things here at home? Some people at the meeting wanted to keep museums in the United States open in a way to, in an effort to keep people calm. But East Coast cities particularly were afraid of possible German air bombing and other violence. Boston's MFA closed its Japanese art galleries for fear of vandalism in retribution for Pearl Harbor. And the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. sent 75 of its greatest works into hiding at the Biltmore Mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. And you see the trucks pulling up. That event was actually the 80th anniversary of this event right there was last week. Everyone at the meeting agreed something needed to be done. The work of George Stout of Harvard was presented to the group. He was developing the entirely new science of art conservation, saving art that had been damaged. And he was particularly interested in saving art that had experienced damage during bombing. Stout had a dramatic idea. He wanted a group of specially trained men to go in with the military at the start of any invasion or operation. It seemed like a too radical an idea for most of the people at the museum meeting. So a year and a half goes by. The Germans continued their advances and their art looting in Europe. Finally, in August of 1943, the Roberts Commission is formed, and they are charged with, and I quote, promoting the preservation of cultural properties in war areas, provided that that mission does not interfere with military operations. They set about making up lists of monuments to protect. And the monuments was the word that they used to describe not only art, but architecturally important buildings, as well as historic documents. Well, it sounded grand, but in reality, the newly created Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives officers, the Monuments Men, experienced tremendous difficulty just getting started. For one thing, there were just a handful of them, and most of them came from academic posts. Few of them had ever had any military experience. Stout was a notable exception. He had previously served in the Navy, where he held the rank of lieutenant commander. They weren't provided much in the way of supplies with which to do their jobs. No cameras, no typewriters. Some of them just brought them from home. And there was uncertainty about their mission. There were these lists of protected monuments, but they were often not given to the officers leading the operation in time, or perhaps they never arrived at all. The Monuments Men were almost on their own, kind of making it up as they went along. They were staying out of the way as best they could, not only out of harm's way, but out of the hair of the military officers or regular military leaders around them. And even though they were given the rank of officers, they were very low-ranking officers. And so they really couldn't order issues to anyone to help them with the protection of the artwork. And transportation seems to have been a recurring problem for the Monuments Men. Here's a photo of Frederick Hart with two very valuable finds, a piece of ancient statuary and a working Jeep. And in some cases, as you can imagine, they weren't all that popular with their fellow troops or commanding officers. They were given a variety of nicknames. Venus Fixers was one of the tamest. Captain James Rorimer, who you see here in the photo, was actually arrested by other US soldiers at one point, because no way were there such things as Monuments Men, and no way did they think that guy was an officer. American soldiers thought he was a German spy, so he was briefly arrested. The situation eased a few months later in December of 1943, now 2 years after Pearl Harbor, with a directive by General Eisenhower, which, and I quote, placed the responsibility of protecting cultural property squarely on the shoulders of every commander, every officer, and every soldier. And it introduced the Monuments Men as allied military government officers who were there to assist with those duties. Their jobs were spelled out for them, and they were enormous in scope. Number one, minimize the damage to art and architecture. Number two, make repairs where possible. Number three, locate missing works. Number four, return missing works to their owners. During the war, a total of only 48 monuments officers were assigned to the whole of Italy, for example. They had a huge job to do, and they were horribly understaffed. In the meantime, Hitler was busy continuing to collect the art he wanted and destroy the art he didn't. He kept close tabs on the location of some of the world's most famous works of art. There were museum officials in every country who tried to protect their pieces. Dutch museum staff took Rembrandt's huge painting, The Night Watch, off the walls of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, and they rolled it up like a giant carpet, and it spent the war years stored in a crate in a castle. Another famous piece that was safe for a while anyway was the magnificent and tender depiction of the Madonna and Child by Michelangelo. This marble sculpture had been in Bruges, Belgium, since it was purchased about 10 years after it was made. So 1514, purchased by wealthy merchants who brought it home to Bruges, Belgium. The local authorities were worried about it. They took it off view and secured it within a room inside the church, but the Nazi troops came in the night to steal it. They took the 4-foot-high sculpture, put it face down on some mattresses, and fled into the night in 2 stolen Red Cross trucks. But we will catch up with the sculpture again, hundreds of miles away in the salt mines. There was one prize at the top of Hitler's list of art, one that he couldn't resist taking because of a long history of the piece that he knew quite well. When you think of the casualties of war and the great losses associated with war, you may not think of art at first, but this work shows the role that art plays in conquest. The piece is the much admired and much fought over Ghent altarpiece. Jan van Eyck created it in 1432 for the the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, Belgium. The piece is enormous. It's 12 feet tall and 16 feet wide, and it's comprised of many painted wooden panels. As you see it right here, it's completely open, but those side panels fold over the central panel and close, and they are also painted on the back side, the reverse, which you're not seeing. In 1799, following the French Revolution, this work was stolen from Ghent and taken to Paris. 2 decades later, in 1815, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, France was required to return the painting to Belgium, only to have in subsequent years several of the panels pawned by the church, and eventually those pawned panels found their way to a museum in Berlin. So before World War I, Germany owned 6 panels of the Ghent altarpiece. But at the end of World War I, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were forced to return those 6 panels to Belgium, to Ghent. Hitler knew this story well, and he hated that the Germans had to give the pieces back. He thought it was a sign of weakness, and he wanted the whole altarpiece together for his museum. In 1940, desperate Belgian officials tried to get it southward to the relative safety of the Vatican, but it didn't get that far. It ended up in a chateau in southwest France, and 2 years later, Hitler sent a team in to take it. We will see it again, though, when the Allies get to the mines. Now, the looting in in Italy was different, because from 1936 on, Italy had been an ally of Germany. Hitler made several state visits to Italy as an art lover. He and Mussolini toured museums in Rome and in Florence. Hitler was captivated, it was said, and Mussolini was an eager associate, allowing historic artifacts to be sold to Germany against the law, but with his permission. Italian museums, some of them officials did protest, but the practice continued. So now we're going to look at what happened to 2 famous towns in Italy as the Germans retreated and the Allied forces advanced up the Italian peninsula. Our first stop is Pisa. And the story, we're stopping here because I think that the story of Pisa shows us that the Monuments Men were thinking about more than just saving art. They were committed to restoring a way of life in an area. The town had come under both Allied and German bombardment. And so by the time the Monuments Men could reach Pisa, They were relieved to see that the 750-year-old cathedral and its very famous Leaning Tower were still intact. But the roof of the 13th century building next to the cathedral, I've circled it in green, the Campo Santo, was missing. It had been burned off, exposing centuries-old frescoes inside to the weather. The wall paintings, the frescoes, also had molten lead dripping across them. Those had been the lead supports of the wooden roof, but when it burned, the lead dripped over the face of the paintings. Captain Deane Keller started calling up the chain of command and persuaded Fifth Army Commander Lieutenant General Mark Clark to send workers and supplies to help save what was left of the frescoes and begin to repair the rest. Keller knew that the town of Pisa was a university town, and he worked very hard to get the university up and running again. And within months, hundreds of students were back at their studies, and the town greatly benefited from his efforts. Now, Florence. Anyone who's been there would agree Florence is a special place. In fact, one of Florence's biggest admirers is Adolf Hitler, who remarked that Florence is too beautiful a city to destroy. Hitler had, in fact, ordered that the bridges remain standing, but as the Germans retreated, his orders were not followed. On August 3rd, 1944, the Germans blew up 5 of the bridges crossing the Arno, leaving the Ponte Vecchio in the rear there to the right, covered with German mines, but still standing. In the photo on the left, you see soldiers trying to remove the mines. And on the right, as visitors today, we may not even be aware of the ragged history of that very bridge. Now, in Florence, there were some priceless art objects that were simply too large to move, or there was not enough time. And so, like Michelangelo's David and his other sculptures nearby there, the associated ones, the captives, they're often called. Well, they were too big to move. There was no more time, so they were left to shelter in place. And here they are, all bricked up in their special little cones and ready to ride out the war. Now I always like to include a map. Here's a good map, because it stresses an important point I want to make. As the Allies advanced, and those are the blue lines, northward up the Italian peninsula and eastward across Europe, the Germans and their Axis forces in red were in a fighting retreat. The once orderly, systematic looting changed. Art was moving faster and further away by more and more desperate Germans. And in the end, it's estimated that there were nearly 1,500 hiding places in the border areas of Italy and Austria and Germany, stashes of stolen art that were meant to eventually make their way into Hitler's possession. Much of the looted material was hidden in the salt mines of the Southern Alps. The mines made a convenient storage space for tens of thousands of works of art, furniture, bags of gold, which you see there on the left, books, photographs, and papers. The salt mines consisted, of course, of miles of tunnels. The Nazis outfitted them with extra lighting and shelving and locks. Now, there were some Nazis who thought that the mines should be destroyed as they fled from the advancing Allies, burying the treasures within. But fortunately, that never came to pass. There were episodes of bravery by local miners, such as you see in the photo on the left, who thwarted the Nazis' efforts to blow up the mines. In this case, I think they tampered with the dynamite that had been in the crate, and therefore it didn't blow. Lieutenant Commander George Stout was among the first monuments men to arrive at Altausi mine and begin the process of reclaiming the staggering number of stolen objects. Some 6,500 paintings alone were recovered from just that mine. General Eisenhower and his staff came to see the discovery for themselves. At Autaussi, the Allies and the Monuments Men had to hurry and clear out the art quickly from the mines because the area would soon be under the control of the Soviets. And the Soviets had their own art squads, sometimes referred to as trophy brigades, taking things back to Leningrad and Moscow as war loot. Stalin's trophy brigades shipped more than 2.5 million art objects from Eastern Germany into the Soviet Union as the war was ending and just after the war. So I told you we'd catch up with them again. Here is the astronomer by Vermeer that once graced the walls of the Rothschilds' salon, being uncovered amongst the stacks of paintings. Here is the Ghent altarpiece, in pieces taken apart and in pieces, and damaged somewhat, but recovered. All of the pieces were there. And I include the photo on the lower right just to show you a reference of size, scale. It's an enormous piece. And what about the Madonna and Child? Here she is getting a more cradled lift out of the mines under the careful eye of George Stout. There he is right in the middle. So what happened next? Well, the Western Allies set up collection points across Europe where about 60 monuments officers stayed for 6 years after the war, working on the restitution, the return of the pieces that were saved. The decision was made by the Western Allies to return all works of art to their country of origin. And then those countries were tasked with returning them as quickly as possible to their owners. Some ceremonial returns were made just to raise the public's spirit. Here is a US Army convoy bringing truckloads of art back into Florence. And there's the one in the front, but if you look over to the left and in the rear, you see the convoy of trucks following, literally being heralded their return into Florence. When the Allies got to Paris in August of 1944, the galleries and the other museums in Paris had been emptied for years. Who they found still working was Rose Valland, the volunteer who had stayed behind at the Jeu de Paume Museum, the Nazis' site for collecting the looted art. For 4 years, Valland had kept secret notes, remembered details. She had made photographs at night of Nazis' negatives and then brought them back to the office the next day. She faced threats not only from the Germans, but also from French who accused her of being a collaborator. She kept hidden from the Nazis the fact that she understood the German language. She was the primary source of information about the Nazi stealing programs in France, and she was able to give the Monuments Men details that she had literally been guarding with her life for 4 years. She was honored by France after the war, and she was given a paying job as conservator at the museum. She wrote a book about the trains loaded with art that left Paris for Germany, and it was made into a dramatic Hollywood blockbuster years ago called The Art Train, starring Burt Lancaster. A new biography, happily, has been published recently about Rose, noting the fact that she continued to pursue missing art for the rest of her career. In Italy, the two main American monuments officers were Deane Keller and Frederick Hart. After the war, Keller went back to teaching at Yale, and when he died, he was honored by the Italians by having his ashes buried at the Camposanto in Pisa that he had helped save. Frederick Hart, who was pictured earlier with the Jeep, he remained committed to the city of Florence the rest of his life. In 1966, he was there working to rescue the art treasures after the Arno River flooded. His ashes are interred in a hilltop church overlooking the city of Florence. In Northern Europe, two men most closely linked with the successes are George Stout and James Rorimer. George Stout actually left Europe shortly after the art-filled mines had been discovered, and he was assigned as a monuments officer to Japan as that theater, as his attentions needed to be there. After the war, he returned to work at the Fogg Museum. Then he became the director at the Worcester Art Museum. Then he became the chief conservator, and following that, the director at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And they've just posted this photo of Stout doing some conservation work there on their website. And James Rorimer, the man who was once arrested by his fellow American officers, returned home and eventually became the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. 2 monuments officers were killed in Europe, both near the front lines in Germany, and both poignantly just in the final weeks of the war. Captain Walter Hutchhausen was an American scholar and architect who was killed in April of '45 by a sniper. And Major Ronald Edmund Balfour was a British scholar working with the Canadian Army. He was killed in March '45 by a shell explosion. If we have time at the end, if anyone's interested, I can quote from Balfour's last letter written about a month before his death. As of now, there's just one American monuments officer left, and that's Richard Barancik, seen here in his wartime photo on the left, and on the far right in a 2015 ceremony when the Monuments Men of World War II were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest recognition for distinguished achievements and contributions. And if you would take a closer look at the medal, you can see that it features some of the art we've been talking about. There at the top on the left, the soldiers are holding up a panel from the Ghent altarpiece, and the soldier down below has his hand on the frame of Vermeer's Astronomer. As Robert said, in the end, 5 million objects or so were recovered, but hundreds of thousands remain missing or destroyed. Even though they were recovered, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have found their way back to their original owners. In many cases, the restitution process has not worked as smoothly as it was intended. Of course, in countless cases, the original owners are dead, I'd say in most cases, of course. Ownership and next of kin problems have arisen. Remember, often the family's papers were stolen or destroyed, so they have difficulty proving ownership. Some of the countries of origin who received the pieces after the war have even tried to keep the pieces for themselves, claiming that, for instance, the families owed back taxes on the value of the works. Or in a very recent case from last year out of the Netherlands, a museum there is trying to justify keeping works of art that they know are looted. They know it belongs to a living relative right there, but they want to keep them because they feel they ought to. They feel that they fit into their collection and that they ought to be in the public domain. It's unimaginable, I think. The process of restitution, though, has had some very happy success stories. A very famous case was turned into the subject of a book and a film called The Woman in Gold, or The Lady in Gold, and it tells the story of this world famous portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by the artist Gustav Klimt. The painting was one of several taken from the family during the war and kept by the Austrian government, who put it in a museum. The case was finally decided by a special tribunal. The rightful owner is the niece of the woman in the picture, and there she is pictured sitting below it, Maria Altman. She wasn't a young woman when she took up this challenge to get the painting back. She told the Los Angeles Times, "They," meaning the Austrians, "will delay and delay and delay, hoping I will die. But," she added, "I will do them the pleasure of staying alive." And she did, and victory was sweet. In 2006, she was awarded her paintings. After the paintings arrived in the United States, she told the reporters, you know, back in Austria, they asked, would you loan them to us again? And I said, we loaned them for 68 years. Enough loans. Before I show the last image, I just want to admit that I am as guilty as the people in this photo of taking the great art around us for granted. My hope is that in the future, we'll be reminded of the efforts of the monuments men and women, as well as the soldiers and civilians who worked so valiantly to save Europe's cultural and heritage and art treasures for the enjoyment of generations to come. Thank you very much. I'm happy to field any questions or any comments you may have. Thank you.
Great, wonderful job, Mary. We do already have some questions, and so
yes.
Folks, I would encourage you to get your comments and questions in. We'll go for another 10 minutes or so. All right, so Diane asks, how many hiding places do they estimate haven't been found yet? And what major works of art that were stolen are still missing?
Oh, good question. I would say that they probably have found all the hiding places by now, or a vast majority of them. There's always the chance that someone would find something in an old ramshackle barn somewhere on the hills of Austria, but I think not. I think for the most part, just about everything that was stashed among those 1,500 or so hiding places has been found. Again, just to reiterate, found doesn't mean returned. Found means given over to the authorities, and then, as we've seen, that's not a smooth ride back to the owners. Some famous ones, there are a couple of, there's a famous Leonardo da Vinci portrait of a woman that's just gone. There are a number, and that's a good question. One of the things that I've given Robert is a sheet of resources, but I can tell you that there are, for instance, websites. monumentsmenfoundation.org is one. lootedart.com is another. There are a number of them that will give a rundown of works, but there are some estimates that 90 to 95% of the high value pieces have been recovered. So that's reassuring. Thank you.
And I failed to mention that when I send the email out later this afternoon, I will include the sources and the resource page. And then Diane had a third question. You had referenced, I think, degenerate art. So what degenerate art by major artists are known to have been destroyed?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have a list myself of things that, so here's the problem with creating a list like that. You'd have to look at an artist's work, or say Picasso, for instance, or you'd have to look at museums' lists of, or the lists of art that were contained in museums before the Nazis took over and after the Nazis took over, to see what they would say. So as far as I know, somebody may have compiled all of that on, say, something like lootedart.com or missing pieces. But yeah, I focus more on pieces that were found, but you're absolutely right. You could easily look up, I guess, lists of things that were once known about and no longer exist. But I would say that, as I said, of the 16,000 that Hitler had his people round up right away, many of them were simply destroyed on the spot. And the records were often destroyed as well.
Karen writes, very interesting and well presented. Diane says, excellent presentation. Ron says, so interesting, Mary. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Diane asks, will there be a link to the recording of this program sent to us? Yes, there will be. Diane asks, thank you so much, or Diane says, thank you so much, Mary. Your presentation filled in a lot of gaps for me. Great information. Mike asks, what happened to art taken back to this to Stalin?
Oh, good question. Thank you. I do So in 1958, I think it was, the Russians, as a goodwill gesture, decided to return some pieces to communist East Berlin and East Germany. And from my recollection here, yeah. So they had taken about 2.5 million pieces with them to Russia. In 1958, they returned about 1.5 million objects and then said, that's it, we're keeping the rest. So about 1 million objects, perhaps still in Russia, that once belonged to other people, and 1.5 million returned to East Germany. Whether those were then subsequently returned to their owners, I'm going to say bet not.
An anonymous attendee says, thank you, and asks, where is Vermeer's astronomer today?
Oh, God, you absolutely. Good question. Somebody look that up quickly. I think it's in The Hague. I think it's in the Netherlands where it's supposed to be. We'll have to Google that really quickly.
I'll see what I can find out for you.
Okay. All right.
Francis asks, was the Louvre in Paris looted? And if not, why not?
Oh, gosh, yes, it was. Absolutely. And so what happened was, all right, we're Googling, yeah, it's, oh no, sorry, it's at the Louvre. The astronomer is at the Louvre. Question, so to the Louvre, yes, absolutely looted. Some pieces got put away in safely, like the Winged Victory, the giant marble sculpture, but most of the pieces were taken to the Jeu de Paume. If you know Paris, it's a museum that is just across the park from the Louvre. And there, you see, what would happen is, and it was, again, as I mentioned, a very orderly looting process to begin with. There was a group under Alfred Rosenberg. He was the Nazi who was in charge of the biggest art gathering scheme, the ERR, they're often referred to. What his people would do would be gather the works of art, photograph them, make a record for them, and then these books of photos would be given to Hitler so that he could pick and choose. And after he got to pick and choose, then people like Hermann Göring got to pick and choose. And then maybe Rosenberg got to pick some as well. And on the down the ranks of his elite leadership. And then the works were transferred to them. So, you know, when they found Hermann Göring's stash up in the mountains they found a lot of the artwork that originally belonged somewhere else.
Michelle says, great presentation. Can't wait to share the recording with my boyfriend who couldn't watch it at this time. Teresa asks, what year did the niece get the Lady in Gold returned? And is it in the US now?
Oh, good question. She did in 2006. Maria Altman lived long enough to have it returned to her. So in 2006, and in that photo, there we go. So the painting is 1907. It was returned in 2006. And you see the man speaking there and gesturing, and at his podium, it says the Neue Gallery, Museum of German and Austrian Art in New York. It is located there. If you, the Neue Gallery is a gallery dedicated to the works of, as it says, German and Austrian pieces. It's right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is Ronald Lauder of Estee Lauder family. And it was his goal to make a beautiful museum of these kinds of pieces. They own other pieces by Gustav Klimt. They also own other pieces that belonged to the Bloch-Bauer family. And so Maria Altman sold the work. After she got it back, she sold it for $135 million to Neue Gallery, and it's there on view. We can't criticize her for selling. She had enormous legal bills, but more importantly, A, she wanted the work to be seen by many people, and B, there's no way that you could have a painting of this value in your little bungalow in Pasadena or wherever she lived and keep it safe. And so there she was, proudly handing it over at the museum.
Anonymous attendee writes, "The Stolen Lady is a work of fiction, but gives a detailed story of how the art of the Louvre was saved."
Yep.
Let me see here. I'm going to mispronounce this lovely name, Mary Antonia. The questions percolating as I listened and watched this program have been answered during the moving and informative presentation.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary Woodward, and to everyone who made this program possible. Very nice. Thank you. Michelle was wondering if you've done any work with the Holocaust Museum.
Oh, I have not. No, but I have worked in other institutions. For instance, most notably the Cleveland Museum of Art, where the staff worked with restitution efforts of several of the large pieces, famous pieces that were in the collection in Cleveland. And I'm always trying to keep up with stories of restitution, but I myself have not been part of any of it, just tangentially, just on the edges. Yeah.
Sure. A few more questions for you, Mary, and then we'll get you out of here at noon.
Okay, no problem.
Diane asks, do we know what Hitler kept for his personal viewing?
Yes, we do. Yes, so they found those pieces and yes, we do. There was record keeping. There were museum curators working for Hitler. I mean, not, he had his own people. Beginning to create this, as I said, the nickname was the Führer Museum. The photo of him overlooking that model city is a model of Linz, Austria, that he was hoping to recreate, a new city or a rebuilt city of Linz, featuring this museum with nothing less than the greatest things in the world. And yes, there are lots and lots of lists. And not all of those things were destroyed. In other words, sometimes, as I said, the Germans were in a fighting retreat in the last year or two of the war. And so they left the papers and things behind. The Monuments Men and the other allies working on this type of restitution were able to locate stashes of papers that would tell them where things were, who they belonged to. So it seems straightforward, but as I said, the return has not always been straightforward.
All right, well, I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable.
Oh, no.
So let's do two more questions and then then we'll get out of here.
Okay,
Ron asks, where is the Ghent altarpiece now? And what about the century painting?
The Ghent altarpiece is in its right church. I mean, it's in Saint Bavo, and so that's good. It's right where it needs to be. And what was the other one? The question?
Yeah, it was the Century, SENTRY, century painting. Does that ring a bell?
I'm sorry, no. Century. Painting, maybe they could elaborate. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, if Ron's still with us, he can put something in the chat. Jeanette, I'm going to save the chat and make sure Mary sees your long comment there. Joyce asks, do you know if there are any more outstanding court cases to reclaim art pieces?
Oh gosh, yes, hundreds, absolute hundreds. Yes. And you can keep track of. I was just going to say the monumentsmenfoundation.org, which will be on the information that Robert sends you. It has regular links to those. But if you just picked up your phone and Googled World War II art restoration cases, your inbox would be filled with information. There are hundreds of pending cases. Yeah.
Gail says, thank you. And she was lucky enough to see the Night Watch in Amsterdam.
Yeah. It's a huge one. Yep, it's a huge one. I'll take 1 second and I'll just read you a few words from Major Balfour's last letter, because it's poignant. It's so touching. And the fact that he passed away right before. He wrote, and this was written a month before he died. He says, it was a splendid week for my job, certainly the best since I came over. On the one hand, there is the tragedy of real destruction, much of it completely unnecessary. On the other, the comforting feeling of having done something solid myself. And he talked about how his storage place in Cleves, the town in Belgium, wouldn't be exactly approved of by Washington because it was the attic of a building that was occupied by troops and refugees. And he says the house is without proper protection and shells fall ceaselessly in the neighborhood, which is of course touching because that's how he died. But he says it's the only building in town that still has roof, doors, and windows. So I think that gives us a glimpse of the level of destruction that these men and women were working with, and how boldly and poignantly and bravely they worked to save this art.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the quote. Susan says enjoyable and informative. Thank you. And Teresa says thanks for a great presentation. She learned a lot.
Thank you.
William, I will make sure that your question is seen by Mary, and perhaps we'll get to it via email. Yeah. Diane says wonderful. Francis says thank you. Well, we've hit 12 o'clock. Mary, any last words before we wrap up?
No, thanks. See you again in February. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So folks, look for an email from me later today with a resources page, with the recording, and with a link to a feedback survey. And in addition, I'll have the registration information for Mary's next talk here, as she said, in February on the origins of museums. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.